The last day of death row. Inmate Stephen Stanko. From model citizen to death row. Hello, friends. Tonight we journey into one of South Carolina's most haunting stories. The case of Stephen Stanko, a man once praised for his intelligence and even known for co-authoring a book about prison life, who would later reveal a far darker side. By day, he walked the quiet aisles of a library, building trust with the woman who loved him, and even befriending an elderly veteran who welcomed him into his home. But behind the mask of charm and intellect, a storm was waiting to break. His crimes would shock the coastal town of Morell's Inlet and leave families torn apart forever. After 2 decades of appeals and courtroom battles, Stanko's journey finally ended in South Carolina's death chamber in June 2025. Stay with us until the end as we uncover his last meal, his final words, and the chilling countdown to his execution. Subscribe now to Deathwatch Diaries for more prison documentary stories. Stephen Stanko was born on January 13, 1968, at the naval base in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, where his father was stationed. His childhood was marked by instability, but those who knew him early on often described him as intelligent, articulate, and capable of achieving much more than his circumstances suggested. Yet, by his late 20s, Stanko had already crossed paths with the law in serious ways. In 1996, he was convicted of kidnapping and assault, crimes that landed him behind bars in South Carolina. While imprisoned, he did something unusual. He co-wrote a book titled Living in Prison, a story of the penal system from within. The book offered reflections on life inside, revealing Stanko's ability to communicate and analyze his surroundings. To those around him, he seemed like a man who might reform, perhaps even use his intellect for good. But freedom did not bring redemption. Instead, it exposed what had been festering beneath the surface. In 2004, after serving 8.5 years, Stanko was released. He first rented a room in Myrtle Beach, disclosing his criminal record honestly to his landlord. For almost a year, he lived without major incidents, though money was always tight and employment remained elusive. To ease his struggles, he struck a deal with a friend in exchange for housing. He would care for the man's elderly mother. This arrangement brought him into closer contact with the local library, where he spent countless hours. He claimed to be researching for another book, but in truth, he was searching for connection, weaving himself into the lives of those who crossed his path. It was there he met Laura Ling, a kind-hearted librarian, who eventually welcomed him into her home. For Laura, he appeared to be a thoughtful man, perhaps misunderstood, trying to rebuild his life. She allowed him to move in with her and her teenage daughter, Christina. Around the same time, Stanko also befriended Henry Turner, a retired Air Force veteran in his 70s who lived nearby. No one could have predicted how tragically these relationships would unravel. On the evening of April 8, 2000, everything changed. Authorities later reconstructed the events in grim detail. Inside the Ling household, Stanko turned on Laura, brutally taking her life. Christina, just 15 years old, was also attacked. Against all odds, she survived her injuries and would later become a crucial witness, her testimony piercing through the courtroom years later. But Stanko was not finished. In the hours that followed, he drove north to Conway, where he targeted his friend Henry Turner. Using deception, he gained entry to Turner's home, claiming a family emergency. Once inside, he struck with deadly force. Turner, a respected veteran, never had a chance. In both cases, Stanko exploited trust, the trust of a partner, the trust of a friend. These betrayals shocked South Carolina, shattering the illusion of safety that his polished demeanor had created. After the killings, Stanko stole Turner's vehicle and emptied his bank account. For several days, he was on the run, weaving through Georgia and attempting to reinvent himself. In Augusta, he posed as a wealthy businessman, even boasting about owning restaurants. But the mask quickly slipped. On April 12, 2005, while attending church, a woman recognized him from news reports and tipped off authorities. USS, marshals closed in. Stanko, who had once enjoyed evading justice, was this time arrested without resistance. Stanko's legal battles stretched across years. He was tried separately for the 2 cases, first for the killing of Laura Ling, and later for the killing of Henry Turner. In both trials, his defense painted a picture of a man suffering from brain abnormalities and a personality disorder, worsened by a teenage head injury. They argued he was not entirely in control of his actions, but the prosecution countered with a harsher view that Stanko was fully aware of what he was doing and took pleasure in exerting power over others. Prosecutor Greg Hembry famously told the jury that Stanko was simply evil. His intelligence, charm, and education were not mitigating factors. They were tools he used to manipulate. Both juries agreed. He was convicted and sentenced to death in both trials. For 2 decades, Steven Stanko lived under the shadow of death at Broad River Correctional Institution in Columbia, South Carolina. There, time slowed. He continued to write, occasionally penning reflections, but the world beyond the prison walls moved on. His appeals wound their way through the courts, but one by one, they were denied. In May 2025, the U.S. Supreme Court rejected his final petition, clearing the way for the execution. On June 13, 2025, Stanko woke knowing the clock had run out. Knowing. His last day followed the rituals familiar to death row, a final meal, the option for spiritual counsel, and the chance for final words. For his last meal, he chose a simple request, a hamburger and ice cream, staying within the $20 allowance permitted by South Carolina law. Unlike some inmates who indulge in extravagant final meals, Stanko's choice was modest, almost ordinary. At 6 in the evening, he was led into the death chamber. Witnesses described him as calm, perhaps resigned. He was strapped to the gurney, an IV line placed in his arm. Before the execution began, he was given the chance to speak. His statement lasted 3.5 minutes. He apologized to the families of Laura Ling and Henry Turner, asking them not to judge him solely by the worst day of his life. He expressed remorse and ended with the words, "Sorry is never enough, but that does not mean it should not be said." With those words, the warden gave the signal. A dose of pentobarbital was administered. Within minutes, Steven Stanko was gone, pronounced dead at 16 minutes past 6 in the evening. Dear friends, the execution of Steven Stanko closed a case that had haunted South Carolina for 2 decades. Once seen as intelligent and even promising, he chose a path that left 2 lives destroyed and many others scarred forever. His final words carried remorse, but no apology can erase the pain endured by the families of Laura Ling and Henry Turner, who waited years for justice to arrive. For some, his execution brought a measure of closure. For others, it only reopened the wounds of what was lost. The story of Stanko reminds us that appearances can be deceiving, and that darkness can hide behind even the most polished faces. It also forces us to ask hard questions about justice, redemption, and the weight of choices that can never be undone. If you found this story compelling, please subscribe to Deathwatch Diaries for more prison documentary stories. Until next time, stay safe.